Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again in another Tuesday of Ayn Rand's essay discussions. Today's essay is one of the fourth whole forum, the new fascism, ruled by consensus. One of the topics that we haven't talked about much, but which was core in Rand's issue of how the world was moving is this idea of fascism. So, James, could you explain a bit more on how Rand conceives capitalism, fascism, and socialism, and what is a mixed economy?
Well, she begins the essay with actually some dictionary definitions of socialism, fascism, statism. And there she gives the standard dictionary definitions from a college dictionary at the time. Socialism, as is well known, is a system of where the ownership and control of the means of production are in the hands of the community as a whole or the government. Land, resources of all kinds, ownership and control of the means of production, all of the means of production. By that, they implicitly mean human beings. That's socialism. Fascism is a system where you have a strong central government that controls everything. It simply controls economic, political. It also doesn't permit any complaints or criticism of the government, but it basically controls the economic world and the political world, as opposed to having title, ownership over the property, the means of production. Statism is still the broader term. It's a system that puts extensive power into the hands of the central government on issues like economics and other things. So in Ayn Rand's view, statism is the broader term under which both fascism and socialism are simply variants. And the significant difference between socialism and fascism is whether or not title, technical ownership of property is kept in the hands of private individuals, although it is utterly and completely controlled by the government, or whether title is taken by the state. In the fascist model, of course, that leaves the property owner with all the responsibilities and burdens of owning property and none of the power, control, or rights of owning property. Capitalism, she had her own definition of her own more exact and historically correct definition. Capitalism is a system that recognizes individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. So for Ayn Rand, capitalism is not a system of government for business or against business. It's a system where the government stays out of business. As she puts it elsewhere, it's the separation of economics and state for the same reasons, essentially, as we have the separation of church and state, religion and state. And so capitalism is a system of freedom that recognizes individual rights as far as she's concerned, and is obviously diametrically opposed to statism or its variants, fascism and socialism.
Now, even today, when one hears conservatives talk about what the left wants, one hears them say that they want to become communist China and that that's what the left consists of. But what did Rand think that we were drifting towards, both from the left and from the right?
This was a speech given in 1965, in the mid-1960s. An interesting moment in American history, actually. The Barry Goldwater, well, let me back up American history a little bit. Following the Great Depression, there was a demand for government intervention in the economy. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt won in 1932, promising to transform government and the economy. And to a large extent, he was successful, although some of it was stricken down by the United States Supreme Court. Much of it stuck. For example, the Social Security system that we have in the United States today, the retirement insurance program, began under Roosevelt. The next Democrat president was also, Roosevelt in his effort to be a reformer was pretty much anti-big business, and rich interests and powerful big business interests were the enemy. And under his successor, Truman, who was also somewhat confrontational with business, as it was with the next Democrat president, Kennedy. In 1965, Johnson had succeeded Kennedy following his assassination as president, and he took a different tack altogether. He invited big businessmen, certain big businessmen in, and became very friendly and cozy with them, asking what they wanted, can we work together, that sort of thing. And there was among pundits, all these pundits that Ayn Rand quotes in this article, from the New York Times, letter writers, economists, philosophers, columnists for the New York Times, were saying that we have transcended ideology. You see, following World War II, there was a general crisis among totalitarians, whether they were fascist or socialist. Socialism, grand ideologies, fascism had failed. By the 1960s, even the left began to acknowledge that communism and socialism, even democratic socialism in Great Britain, were failing. And so it was an age in which the left was sort of backing off this whole idea of ideology. We don't want to be, strictly speaking, firmly in the camp of one strict, consistent ism, some ideology. No. We want to have a meta political ideology, a transcendent political ideology that goes beyond ideology. We need all the significant groups in our political world to sort of compromise and moderate. And so democracy, consensus, became an ideology that sort of smeared out all the differences. So what we have is not a system of one ideology, capitalism or socialism over here. No, what we have to do is compromise, meet in the middle, the vital center, as one very important social commentator, Walter Lippmann, put it in the 1960s. Or the New York Times columnist Wicker said, what we have to do is compromise on everything. And so we have to transcend these old-fashioned ideologies, these isms, and we have to put aside our extremist viewpoints and just get along. You know, every major group has to get along. If your ideas are not so awful that they are beyond the pale, just too extreme for us. And of course, the result of that is necessarily the end of capitalism. The end of capitalism. It is, in effect, a call for fascism. If communism, socialism, calls for the ownership, the collective governmental ownership of all property, and fascism sort of leaves private title, at least, in the hands of private individuals, but seeks ever increasing controls over it, then that's exactly what rule by consensus is saying. If, in fact, democracy, economic democracy, and this is a word that Ayn Rand does not use, she believed that there was a proper role of democracy. She believed that the consent of the governed was the way to go. But she believed that the only kind of legitimate democracy was one that was limited, where the government's power, where the majority's power is limited by individual rights, much as the United States Constitution does. The opening lines to the United States Bill of Rights: Congress shall make no law establishing a religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, limiting freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of peaceful assembly. So in other words, no matter how big the Democratic majority, no matter what your consensus, individuals have rights that cannot be touched by the majority. If you do not have moral principles limiting democracy, what you have, in effect, is a kind of fascism. Fascism by implication. So this ideology that was supposed to transcend ideologies and says everyone needs to compromise. You capitalists over there, and you need to compromise your property rights. Socialists, well, you can't have total ownership of the means of production. So what we have to do is meet in the middle here and have controls over your property. That's the fascist model.
Now, right now, it just occurred to me that I was watching the documentary of Obama. It's not Obama, but the whole development of financial crisis, and they interview Obama on what was his view and his policies during the presidential campaign, which eventually led to his election. And he very proudly says that he called McCain, the contender from the Republican side, and told him, we don't want any ideologies regarding the financial crisis. We don't want to touch and talk about this. We don't want to politicize this. So what, are you on my side or not? And don't you think that that's the complete opposite that should have been done? Like if it's such an important issue to that it will develop ideologies and will become a contentious issue, and it will be very important to sort it out. Shouldn't
That's what ideas
ideologies should be?
matter. That's what ideas matter. That's when you'd think that what we want is clear thinking on the issue, right? We want truth. We want ideas. What we don't want is some kind of compromise between, the thing that got us into trouble in the first place, right, and something else. And who knows if that idea is even the correct idea. But ideas are the only way to understand the world, to deal with the world. And so rather than eschewing ideas, backing away from ideology, and that's sort of been, ideology has become a dirty word, you see. And so by the time of Johnson, he wanted to deal with certain businessmen. And of course, there were certain businessmen who wanted to deal with him. And I think that since Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, Democrats are more on that model. Let's be partners with business. But of course, a partnership between a guy holding a gun and the guy trying to voluntarily do his job, there's no real partnership any more than there's a partnership between a thief and his victim. So this whole idea of government-private partnership, which is so fashionable these days. Trump was big on this public-private partnership nonsense, as if there could be a valid partnership, stolen concept from voluntary partnerships on the free market, right? Voluntary cooperation. But when you're doing it with the government, there's nothing voluntary about it. But presidents since Johnson, maybe not Carter so much, although to some degree, but certainly Clinton, Obama, and now Biden, the Democrat presidents that we've had since Johnson have been eager to meet with big businessmen, eager to work with them to set up controls for their industry, regulate their industry, because we all know, after all, no industry can go completely unregulated. We got to have certain regulations, and of course, those work to keep out competitors. We have to have some subsidies. I mean, we have to prefer some businesses over others in our industrial policy, but of course, that favors some businessmen over other businessmen. And so it becomes what some people call crony capitalism. The better term would probably be crony socialism, but it's cronyism in a mixed economy. And that's the other term we didn't have. A mixed economy is an unstable, unprincipled mixture, according to Ayn Rand, and that's what we're living in. We're living in a world in which principles don't govern, but consensus governs. You get a big enough gang of a large enough segment, and you should at least have the right to get to the meeting table where everyone sits down and compromises everyone's ideas and comes up with something that no one is ultimately satisfied with at the end of the day. Now, Biden is probably not as competent at it, but he'll invite big tech people in, and certain figures and industries that he likes that want those controls in, even as he attacks business. Yeah.
I want to return a bit more to the relationship between business and government, particularly with this idea of the Great Reset, and the Canadian protesters. But could you update us a bit more on what has happened since? Because I think there was this push and this hooray for the militant middle back then. And I think that has lost a lot of steam, particularly over the last 10 years.
I think you're right. To a large extent, the left has grown more intensely ideological, but they were always there. There were always the far leftists, the socialists and communists who were out there demanding more. Our Democrat and labor leaders are the ones who are striking the plea for consensus. They're more the successful ones. And if I can give you an example from recent American politics, Joe Biden, our current president, ran for the nomination of his party against figures who were far more ideological, outright called themselves socialists, like Senator Bernie Sanders or the extreme progressive Elizabeth Warren. And Joe Biden won handily the Democratic nomination among Democrats. This is when just Democrats were voting. They chose Biden. And they chose Biden because he said he wasn't a socialist. I'm not Bernie Sanders. I'm not Elizabeth Warren. I'm not a socialist or an extreme progressive. I'm this person who unified the country. Unity. That is we talk about code word for rule by consensus. Talk about a code word for a compromise on any values, which is in effect a total concession to the socialists at the end of the day, right? Because once you've conceded the principle, then you know which way the negotiations will always go. And so in that sense, Biden is another classic, I don't want to call myself a socialist. I want to go for consensus and unify kind of guy. But at the end of the day, what wins? What wins? He is now in effect, effectively, de facto, a puppet of the progressives. A puppet of the progressives, because that's the only direction he can go in. But also because I think you're right, to a large extent, the left has grown louder. I think that there tends to be an oscillation, right? If the right's in power, the left tends to grow louder. If the left's in power, the right tends to grow a little louder, although no more principled. But it is the left that are the strident, consistent ones with their ideology. And they're always there, and they're always willing to push the left further along, and they're always able to get the right to compromise and push things ever more and more in a leftist socialist direction.
Don't you think that also it happens on the right? Like the whole clean the swamp sentiment was related to this as well, don't you think?
Yes, I think so too. It's as if, well, all we need is, honest dictators. If we had an honest economic dictator, everything would be okay. And so there's all this focus on corruption. You can buy politics. Joe Biden is a classic example of influence peddling. I think we all know that now. His son and his brother were collecting millions of dollars for foreign interests for many, many years based on the access to Senator or Vice President and now President Joe Biden. But they wouldn't have that power in the first place if the government and democracy and the consensus was limited by individual rights. If we had a principled form of government that limited the powers of government, there wouldn't be this ability to be so corrupt. And so you're absolutely right. The right will focus on corruption and clean government and good government as if that were the real issue. The real issue is the power the government has in the first place. That power will inherently tend to encourage corruption and foster corruption. But the corruption is only a byproduct of how much power the government had in the first place to dispense favors and regulations at all. It's as if good government is all we need is saintly economic dictators, and that'll be okay. But economic democracy is nothing better than theft and slavery. Economic democracy, which is what a lot of people, both right and left, say, well, yeah, we got to have economic democracy. You can't go to extremes. Think about that term, extremism. Another article Ayn Rand wrote about the anti-concept, extremism. It's a smear. It's a smear, as if every new good idea begins in the mind of one person. Every new idea is first a minority idea until it gains wider acceptance. This whole idea that somehow democracy is inherently good because, this is just the given, the moral. But look, if 9 people out of 10 say that we should steal all your money or enslave you, Alejandro, does that make slavery okay? Does that make theft okay? Because that's a supermajority? No, it doesn't. Democracy, consensus must be limited by right. That's what will give rise to corruption, is when government is not limited by individual rights.
Now, this is more or less related to one thing that Rand's describing, which is Senator Goldwater's campaign, in which this kind of people that are like, oh, shalala, I love you, everyone here is in love with each other, let's make consensus. And then this guy comes over and it's a bit more radical than these people, and they have hatred for him. Why is that? Why do they spat so much hatred for him?
Following the New Deal and the Depression in the 1930s and Franklin Roosevelt's institution for the first time of major elements of a welfare system on the federal level in the United States, most Republicans ran for cover and compromise and cowardice And take President Eisenhower, the Republican president, that did happen in between all that. He was a total compromiser. He had no principles. He didn't believe in capitalism. He wasn't stridently out there advocating individual rights or the free market. No, he was not. He basically set in stone a lot of the ideas that had been developed by Roosevelt in the 1930s. In 1964, something different happened in the Republican Party. Ayn Rand, at first, was an advocate of the campaign of Barry Goldwater. He said, extremism, he had a great quote, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the defense of justice is no virtue. Just saying that is an impressive thing because he was challenging this rule by consensus, right? There are certain things that are moral principles that transcend and that condition his political ideology. As the campaign wore on in 1964, it became plain to Ayn Rand that he was not a consistent advocate of the free market at all, just a different mix of a mixed economy. So she was very disappointed and thought that he really wouldn't inspire big support, and that's true. That took a lot of wind out of his sails, in my view. He also had a hard time in the wake of Kennedy's assassination. But between those two factors, Goldwater lost a big loss. And it was at that, a lot of people criticized the Goldwater campaign, not because of what he was saying, but because he was too extreme. But because we need to, we need to compromise. We need to be able to moderate. We need to be able to find that vital center, as Walter Lippmann was calling it back then. So these people weren't looking for an ideologue of any kind. Ideology kind of had a dirty name, whether it was consistent free market ideology or consistent socialist ideology. It had failed. We all know big ideas fail, sort of like Hayek, right? Big ideas, big ideologies about social things are to be distrusted altogether. And you still have that idea. Well, a lot of just postmodernism on the left is exactly that. We know Marxism has failed. We want to kind of stick to Marxist policies, but we really don't have an organizing ideology to defend it like we once did. But the Barry Goldwater campaign was it frightened a lot of people because they thought, well, here's a principled person who's actually going to be standing up for old American values, individual rights, the free market. Turned out he really wasn't, but that was enough to scare these moderates, these consensus advocates, these advocates of a new kind of fascism, in effect. It just encouraged them, gave them a bigger megaphone. And so the next Republican president, Richard Nixon, probably did more to help the welfare state and the federal regulatory state than most Democrat presidents of the 20th century. A total disaster in Richard Nixon, who caved on the free market altogether.
Also related to this supposed Shangri-La attitude of the moderates, which in reality was kind of fearful, is this idea that Rand makes that in the 30s, liberals or people on the left were like these big ideas, people that were trying to push for a very specific agenda, and they looked intellectual. And then in the 60s, what you see them go through is like a phase of existential dread. Could you comment a bit on that?
Right. It's the historical development that I was just referring to. Honest observers by the middle of the 20th century realized that socialism in all its variants, Nazism, National Socialism, Mussolini's type fascism, worker state type guild socialism, didn't work any more than communism had worked in the Soviet Union. Now it was decades into it. And even by the 1960s, democratic socialism in Great Britain was perceived as a failure. Now, this didn't. Our intellectuals didn't come back to a consistent free market ideology. First of all, there were no moral defenses of the free market before Ayn Rand. But more than that, capitalism had had such a dirty name associated with it, and the leftists had succeeded in smearing capitalism as government for big business. You see, not government neutral on the issue of economics, but government for big business, actively intervening on their part. So our only choice, you see, was between communism and fascism. And those are the only two options. So if you're a capitalist, you're a fascist, you see, If you anything else is, the more idealistic socialism or communism. So, but by the middle of the 20th century, ideology was itself a dirty word. Extremism was a bad thing. Now think about what a bizarre thing that is. Don't you want extreme prosperity? Don't you want an extremely, free society? Don't you want to be extremely happy? No, extreme as such is not a bad thing at all. What they were saying is people who have ideas that lay outside the normal spectrum can be ignored, And so long as we get rid of those unacceptable ideas, so long as it represents a major segment of our democratic population, then we should get together, and those kind of groups should compromise their ideals and find something in the middle.
Now,
that was the main idea.
let me thank Bonnie for her generous super chat, and also to Robert, who says the crucial need for definitions. Fascism isn't them, quote them. It isn't a, quote, side, unquote. It isn't a convenient insult to sling. Good discussion. Read this essay.
Yes, indeed. Fascism is, it's funny because all you have to do is take a stand for freedom, and it's an individual freedom, mind you, consistent stand for freedom, right? In 2008, we had a financial crisis on Wall Street in the United States, and a Republican president bailed out Wall Street. Major firms like Goldman Sachs, some huge financial firms in the world, were bailed out by the federal government by a Republican president. That is government intervening on behalf of big business. That is not capitalism. And yet, if I were to come out and I were to advocate, no, don't bail out Wall Street. Let Goldman Sachs fail if Goldman Sachs or the Lehman Brothers fail if they have to fail, if that's what the free market says. It may have a negative economic consequence, but better to get that economic consequence out of the way and move on and get rid of these bad actors. That's how capitalism works, by letting big businessmen fail. If I were to say that, I would still be accused of being a fascist. Even though I'm consistently advocating individual liberty and on principle, as a matter of right. So Robert is exactly correct. Fascism is the most misused, overused, badly used term out there. If anything, it's this rule of consensus that de facto leads us to fascism, as Ayn Rand points out.
Yeah, and related to this non-ideological attitude, in this same documentary that I was watching on the crisis, I didn't remember that Paulson just went to the Congress and said, I want 600 billion pounds, dollars. And they asked to him, like, why do you want it? And he's like, I don't know. I just want it. And then he asked for less money. And originally it was going to be made out to purchase bad assets from banks, which basically it's a fear of banks that basically they buy bad things and they basically relieve the banks, and it's not technically capitalizing banks, which is a more or less socialism,
right?
And
sort of an indirect socialism.
And that was the idea. But right. At the last moment, Warren Buffett calls Paulson and says, well, what if let's capitalize banks? And they say, like, oh, okay. From one moment to another, no ideology, no purpose, nothing.
No principles, no rights, no long-term effect need be considered. You'd think this is the moment when we need to become ideological, where ideas matter, where we need to go back to our economic and, even more important, our moral principles about government and society. Those should be the touchstones now. And on principles, there can be no compromise. Ayn Rand uses so many wonderful examples on this. A thief breaks into my home and wants to steal all my silver. If I start negotiate with him, okay, just take the spoons, leave me the forks and the butter knives, but you take those. I've conceded the entire principle, and it's only a matter of time before the thief is going to come back and demand more, because I have conceded the principle. And that's the nature of this. When you concede the principle of liberty, when you concede the principles that underlie human prosperity, you know underlie human success, then you have conceded the principle altogether. You have destroyed the principle. Principles are, once identified, principles are in effect an off-on switch. Liberty is either present or it isn't. The conditions of prosperity are there or they are not. And any compromise can only be, as John Galt says, any compromise between food and poison, it's only poison that can win.
In the same essay, there's a quote about Orrin Boyle, and that's, I think, probably one of the core questions that I was left with the essay. So I want to pitch it to you to explain to me what does it mean. It's first talking about. Let me quote it completely. So, quote: "It is the creators of wealth, the handreaders, who are destroyed under the forms of statism, socialists or communists or fascists. It is the parasites, the Orrin Boyles." Sorry, something is boarding over here. Who are the privileged elite and the profiteers of statism, particularly of fascism. The special profiteers of socialism are the James Taggarts of communism, the Floyd Ferrises. So, why are what is the difference between the Taggarts, the Boyles, and the Ferrises that makes them thrive in these different environments?
I kind of have to do a spoiler alert here for people who haven't read Atlas Shrugged. Spoiler alert. We're going to be talking about characters in Ayn Rand's monumental novel Atlas Shrugged, which you really should read. So if you don't want spoilers, tune it down right now. Hank Rearden is one of the great heroes of Atlas Shrugged, and he is a brilliant businessman who made it on his own from nothing, and he is so creative, he's invented a new metal that will change industry altogether. His competitor is this fellow named Orrin Boyle in the novel, and he is constantly seeking, a compromise with Hank Rearden. Hank Rearden shouldn't be the only one to benefit from his invention, Rearden Metal. He should share with you can't put out all his competition out of business. That would be anti-competitive. So in the name of freedom, Orrin Boyle is advocating compromise. A compromise that would be outright theft of the creative genius, Hank Rearden. It's outright theft of this guy. But you see, it's a political compromise. It's a sharing procedure that he's advocating. Why can't all of we steel manufacturers somehow get along and share the goods and so forth? Someone like Floyd Ferris is the director of the State Science Institute. He is thriving as a dictator. He has absolutely no interest, in effect, in the compromise. He's your more consistent ideologue, the beneficiary of outright communism. And in effect, James Taggart is advocating. James Taggart is the president of the largest railroad in the United States in the novel. And what he really would love to see happen is railroads be completely put under one umbrella, and he's the guy. Well, why should there be competitors to Taggart Transcom? We've laid all these railroad lines across the country. Why should it be wasteful, duplicative effort to have any competitors build other train tracks? We, the largest, Taggart Transcontinental, should just come in and manage everything under government supervision. And that way he wouldn't get the blame, government would get the blame. So it's the total don't blame me, don't blame me, don't blame me James Taggarts who really benefit under communism, because they're the one provider in his dream. They'd be the one provider of the socialist service, like Floyd Ferris directing the State Science Institute. Someone like Orrin Boyle, though, is the quintessential archetype of the businessman who would accept the invitation from Lyndon Johnson or President Biden to come to the White House and discuss his needs and what we can do to eliminate dog-eat-dog competition from all those other guys and maybe help out a vital industry that needs being helped out. You see, get your foot in the door with socialism and it's all over, of course. You're heading headlong into socialism, in effect, but it's how you get there. And it's these compromisers like these, pro-business moderates who just want to regulate business and make it more fair, and businessmen who just want a share of the wealth and cooperate, versus the top-down socialist communist, the outright takeover the creation of one of these people states in Atlas Shrugged. Does that make sense?
Lot. Thank you very much. I had never figured out the full differences between these three characters.
Oh, the villains make a wonderful, each of them is a different thing, too. In Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand is demonstrating something unique with each of her villains. They are not to be sort of painted with a broad brush and thought of as all the same. She's making a distinct point with each of her villains, just as she is with each of her heroes, and just as she is with each of her mixed characters who learn or don't learn along the way. It's an amazing novel.
It is, certainly. So what can this essay enlighten us about today's world? Could you talk about a bit more about the Great Reset or the expropriation of savings of Canadian protesters a couple of months ago?
You've got your Trudeaus out there who really do admire China, and they let it slip. The mask slips sometimes, and they let it out. Boy, I wish I could be like China. And look at what's going on in China today, as they're padlocking people into their homes, and you can hear screaming children inside the homes as they can't get out to get fresh air or food. Right? Look at the lockdown in China today. In any event, a while back, before this, Trudeau was, salivating with envy that as Prime Minister of Canada, he couldn't be quite as, powerful as Xi and take total control. But we saw it come through in the way he went after not just the truckers who were blocking that bridge, but anyone who contributed any money to the truckers who were trying to protest. So he really, under his skin, he really is a dictator who would really love to do away with rights altogether so that all of this could be done away with and he could just take control over Canada's economy. And you could hear it too when COVID happened. There were left-wing pundits who thought COVID was the best thing that could ever possibly happen. I don't know if you're familiar with the famous American movie actress from years back, a woman named Jane Fonda. She was a political activist and an international movie star for many years. She said that COVID was God's gift to the left. God's gift to the left. So, in other words, it's okay for her if there's a disease that kills millions of people, so long as it empowers the left. And look at what happened. They called for a great reset. This is our opportunity, COVID, they said, to reorganize and rethink the economy altogether. So yeah, there are these more consistent ideologues. There are these more consistent socialists and communists out there, and they're the ones with the gravitational pull. Right? They're the ones with the moral high ground. So they're the ones constantly driving the debate. But you've still got Joe Biden out there willing to compromise, and he's willing to change if he has to say A one day and next year say non-A at the same time and in the same respect, he will do so. He's the kind of politician who can turn on a dime. He's not wedded to any kind of ideology. And yet, look at, in effect, where he is. He's okay, we don't need any more lockdowns. And boy, but I wanted that mask mandate. And I'm saying, well, I may not, though, do that because it's not politically opportune right now. He's that kind of a politician. He's like Lyndon Johnson, in effect. Note that even these compromise types like Lyndon Johnson and Biden are some of the most aggressive in producing results for the left. Precisely because they're taking a non-ideological. Joe Biden never tires of saying, I became president because I wasn't the socialist that Bernie Sanders was. I'm not a socialist. I'm for the free market. Now, let me give you this control. Let me increase deficit spending. Let me create more regulations. Let me destroy the fossil fuel industry. Those compromisers can actually achieve a lot more sometimes than our consistent ideologues can, because they can scare the populace.
Certainly. I was hearing today about Spain's government, and they have a very leftist government. But the people who have moved the most to the left aren't the politicians, but the academics, which used to be considered to be the moderates, with the pension system or with other developments in the latest year.
Yeah, progressives have grown more aggressive. Socialists have grown more aggressive, but I think that there is a large group of people in North America and Europe who are skeptical of socialism. They've seen historical experience over the last 100 years. They've felt it in their own lives. And so when you've got a large constituency in Western Europe and North America that's skeptical of outright socialism, where socialism is beginning to get, a bit of a dirty name, then the politician's best bet is to invent some new third way, or to say, I am for consensus, I'm for compromise, I'm not an extremist. But of course, without a clear ideology, without ideas, they are subject to the winds, to the cultural winds of the time. And unfortunately, those are being set by the most consistent ideologues out there, even if they are a minority, the hardcore progressives and socialists.
Now, Rand mentions that the fascism that it's being that the government is moving towards fascism, but in a very de facto way, not in a full movement as it happened with Mussolini or with Hitler. Do you think that has changed? Do you think that that there are more voices going towards that end goal?
Ayn Rand observes a very important point here, that in trying to find this middle of the road compromise, they didn't realize what they were doing was defending fascism. They didn't realize that they had, in effect, let the fascist cat out of the bag. And I think that a lot of the criticism today that central governments face is that realization that that's what this is fascism. It's as if the mask did slip, and in their effort not to scare people into thinking that they were socialists, in their effort to say, no, let's do this compromise, rule by consensus, people have figured out that, in effect, unlimited democracy really is just another kind of dictatorship. Unlimited democracy really is just a kind of fascism. And one of the disturbing things is even the left now is sort of dropping the pretense that they were ever in favor of civil liberties. They are now strident advocates of censorship, when the consistently hardcore leftist ones are. And so we have, in effect, we have a left that is growing more and more explicitly totalitarian. And yeah, I think there is a stronger and stronger ideological divide where the issue is becoming more drawn and clear, in at least we're able to draw and make it more clear when we can. What they're advocating is fascism and these so-called middle-of-the-roaders. But what we still don't have is a consistent, apart from Ayn Rand, what we still don't have is a consistent ideology of freedom and individual rights. And that's really what needs to happen if we're really going to change the atmospherics of politics in the West.
Was it Churchill who said that fascism would come disguised as anti-fascism?
Yeah, Churchill said something like that. That is a remarkably prescient comment, isn't it? And Ayn Rand was saying, in effect, the same thing for many decades. Yes, yes. There were certain critics of the New Deal at the time who feared that that's exactly the direction that we would go in, that this sort of New Deal welfare statism was just a pretty mask for Mussolini fascism. There were people who said that back in the 30s. People who said that back in the 30s, literally people who compared FDR to Mussolini and Franco. So, which makes the better comparison, doesn't it?
Yes. I was quite surprised that during the lockdowns, Antifa didn't say a peep. Like, people were locked down, people were like literally put down in their houses, not being able to move, not allowed to move, not to do anything. They didn't complain.
Yeah, they don't mind totalitarianism. Totalitarian control, total control of your life. If the government says you're under house arrest and your business closes and that's that, they take orders. It's not the idea of orders from the government that they object to. No, no, no. No, no, no.
Daniel is correcting me. He says the quote is, "The fascists of the future will call themselves anti-fascists." It is to give it is to give to Churchill, but he didn't say it actually. Okay.
There were numerous writers in America, though, who were comparing FDR to Mussolini and Franco. That's a reality.
So let me give you a final question and to end it with a more positive tone. What would you say about the virulence of today? And what do you think about Elon Musk complaining about the regulatory government?
Well, we need more business people to be complaining about the regulatory state. Every single regulation is a barrier to entry. Every single regulation adds costs to entering that field, and therefore tends to be pro-coercive monopoly. If our free market is not so efficient, you can blame it on every single regulation out there. And the more regulation, the less the free market works. So Joe Biden can say, I'm a capitalist, I'm not for socialism, and then advocate 1,000 more regulations without even understanding what capitalism really consists of. So what we need is fewer coward. See, I know many big businessmen actually sincerely may believe these leftist ideas, but I also know many of them are responding to the popular winds of the time. They are cowards. They are simply going along to stay in business as best they can. It takes a certain amount of courage to defend one's long-term self-interests. And that's what these cowardly businessmen compromising along the way are doing. They're slitting their own throats without knowing it. They have conceded the long-term issue, which could only mean the destruction at the end of the day of their ability to do business. So we need more long-term principled business people to have the courage to stand up and advocate the free market. Elon Musk is not a perfect advocate of the free market by any means, but he certainly is, all things being equal, compared, as I say, the three most important words in economics and history are compared to what? Compared to other business people today, he is an advocate of general free market, and he is acting, he's doing something about it. If there, Twitter isn't censoring anybody. Twitter is a privately owned company. If they have their own editorial policies, if they have their own filtering policies, it's their property and they can do it. It's not, strictly speaking, censorship at all. Now, can I disagree with their editorial policy? Sure. But the way to fix that in a free market is to do exactly what Elon Musk is doing. Buy control, either make it a totally private company and buy 100%, or by controlling it, the 30, 40, or 50% he'd need to control it so he can change their policy. That's how the free market works. You'll notice that our friends on the left were huge advocates of private forums until they had no problem with a billionaire Mark Zuckerberg having total control over Facebook and Instagram. They had no control with Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, owning the Washington Post, one of the most influential newspapers in my country. No, that's just free enterprise and free speech. But now that Elon Musk wants to take control over Twitter, suddenly that's just evil itself. They don't have principles at all, and they're willing to chuck those principles whenever convenient.
Thank you very much, James. Is there anything that you would like to add? Maybe we didn't discuss, but you were eager to say.
Yeah, I want to return to this idea of democracy. It's a concept that Ayn Rand did not include in this essay, you'll notice, right? Mm-hmm. And yet what is ruled by consensus but the idea of unlimited democracy? Unlimited democracy is no better than some kind of dictatorship. It doesn't matter to me if I'm being enslaved, literally made a slave. In the American South before the Civil War, if you'd taken it to a vote in, say, the state of Georgia, a large majority, and even if the slaves could have voted, a large majority would have voted to keep slaves in their condition. Democracy does not make slavery moral or legitimate. Democracy does not cast magic pixie dust over some bad policy and turn it into a moral or an effective policy. A lot of people think that democracy is some kind of moral salve that turns something into some governmental action into something more legitimate than it otherwise would have been. But if you elect an Adolf Hitler, democracy is no friend to freedom, right? A democracy that is not limited by individual rights like the original idea of like American Republic. The American Republic was originally set up to be representative democracy that was severely limited in its power to restrict individual rights and liberties. Without that, all you have is dictatorship. Democracy is no better than an outright authoritarian or totalitarian dictator if it is not limited by the moral principle of individual rights.
Amen. Let me thank Teresa Dean for her last-minute super chat. Innovation, creativity, and regulation. She says, "Let business do what it is good at, what it's good at, build, produce, and trade."
Thank you. Agreed. Amen.
Well, thank you so much, James. These talks are really enlightening. I thank you especially for that question on the orange boil. I had never thought about that, and I'm really eager to continue this discussion next Tuesday.
Always great. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Always wonderful.
Thank you.
See you next week.
See you next week.